Welcome, everyone, to the virtual launch of the newest in our recovered book series from Boiler House Press. It's An American Journey by Ethel Mannin. And with us today, we're very delighted and honored to have Joanna Pocock, who was not just the introduction writer, but in some way sort of a co-conspirator in the project of reissuing this book. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I want to start by a little presentation about both Ethel Mannin and the context of this book for those who don't know her, because she's just an amazing individual, but also to give you some understanding of the book if you haven't had a chance to read it yet. So if you'll bear with me for a second here. So I came across An American Journey back in 2015. It was a year I had dedicated in my neglected. Sorry, I've got a. I don't know why we've got a. Okay, there we go. Um, my neglected books page, which is sort of the basis, origin of the recovered book series about bringing forgotten books and writers back to light through bringing them back to print. And in 2015, I dedicated a year to reading only the work of women writers, which was just a fantastic experience, such a good experience that I kept it on for another year. And so one of the books that I read that year was American Journey by Ethel Mannin. And quite frankly, the number one reason I read it is because I saw this cover on Abe Books, and it was just we'll show it in a few minutes the full in its full glory. But to me, it's one of the top 10 book covers of all time, and I regret that we weren't able to steal it. Uh, but also, I really Ethel Mannin, I sort of liked and didn't like the book, and I have to say I like this book and admire it much more sort of over the course of time and in retrospect as I've gone through it to edit it and clean it up and annotate it. At first, Ethel Mannin is if nothing else, she is uncompromising. Uncompromising in her views of others, of herself as well. And so there's a fair amount of caustic observation and irascibility that pervade this book that can take a little getting used to if you've never encountered Ethel Mannin before. So a little bit about Ethel Mannin. She was born at the turn of the century and lived through much of the century and really had a pretty remarkable life. Uh, she married very young. She married at the age of I think 19 or 20, had a child right away in her first marriage. And sort of as a way to escape that relationship, she started writing. She published her first novel in 1923, pretty much because she decided this was one of the ways that a woman could make a living in that time frame. And she just felt like, well, there can't be that much to it. So she just sat down and wrote this novel about a girl working in sort of a workhouse environment, a working class girl. A novel called Not Martha, which is super hard to find now. I don't think there are any used copies available. And she did very well. Her books were well reviewed. And she was in the middle of sort of the jazz age London, the Bright Young Things, although she was a little bit older than the Bright Young Things, and she had already had a child. But she was in the midst of things, and among other things, is believed to have had affairs with both W.B. Yeats and Bertrand Russell, and who knows who else in the course of time. She and her husband separated during this period. And she also was an inveterate traveler. So this is one of the pictures she's got in one of the many memoirs she wrote. This is Young in the 20s, which has some interesting photos, including this one. This is her daughter, Mannon and her daughter, about to fly to Paris, one of the very early scheduled airline trips around. In addition to writing fiction, she also picked up money on the side by writing these advice pieces. So here's a piece from 1926 about home as a career. She was not in favor of that, by the way, if it's not no spoiler alert there. And one of the folks that one of the guys that she knew about, Douglas Goldrin, who started out as sort of a novelist, but eventually became more of an editor and a nonfiction writer. He wrote this memoir in 1945, and one of the ones he mentions is as Mannin, who says, and he says later in her career she developed a social conscience, as if that's something that one goes into kind of as in you could pursue golf or you can develop a social conscience. And fortunately, he says snarkily, without diminishing her sales, no surprise that Goldring was not a best-selling novelist. And so then I went on and I kind of dove into Ethel Mammon's memoirs. She wrote six books that you could consider memoirs. All of them are sort of a mix of memoir and sort of, in fact, her first memoir is called Confessions and Impressions. And that's a great description of the book because the first half is sort of her memories of growing up and her rebellious spirit. And then the second part is really just chapters that are impressions of people that she knew in the 1920s. So in her very last memoir, which is this book, Sunset over Dartmoor, which came out in 1977, so she's 77 years old at that point. She mentioned that she had written 95 novels. I mean, so she was one of these sort of Victorian era polymaths brought forward to the 20th century. So if you look in the front section opposite the title page of Sunset and Over Dartmoor, and I have a copy courtesy of the Kingston, Ontario Public Library discards. Um, she lists 41 novels, and then she has at the bottom of that list, she has this etc., as if 41 isn't enough. And it turns out that the etc. was in addition to publishing novels as books, she also, through much of the 30s and 40s, had an active career as a newspaper serial writer. So she wrote serial novels for the newspapers that were never published in book form. And so we can see this is one called A Bridesmaid about what happens to Gladys. But she also wrote, among the many things she wrote, was a little book which, uh, whoops, I need to change my mic. Sorry, it unconnected on me for some reason. Sorry. Is my sound different now? It's okay? Okay. Um, So she wrote this little memoir of her father. This was published in 48, I think, 52. Yeah, it's hard to see. There's no dust jacket on it. Her father, and in that book, she writes something that I think is really reflective of her approach as well. And she says of him, his socialism went a great deal deeper than any politics or party policy. It was the authentic socialism of the early Christians, the true communism of all things in common. And if you read her work, and even in American Journey, I think you get a strong sense of that, which was her politics were highly individual. And she actually, in her fiction, wrote a lot that was sort of dabbling with understanding characters who had religious experiences. She has a novel, for example, called Bavarian Story, which is based on a true story of a Bavarian village that for many years had a lighted cross up on their mountainside outside their village, and the Nazis asked them to take that down, and the village sort of revolted against that pressure because they wanted to have that sort of religious symbol as part of their culture and maintained. And I think in all fairness, contrary to what Goldring said, that she didn't have her beliefs out of sort of developing a social conscience. I think she came out of the womb with it. And so, like in 1942, for example, she had a split with George Orwell because she was an ardent pacifist, and even her daughter from her first marriage, Jean Porteous, was among 22 women conscientious objectors who were put on trial for refusing to take public service. So in 1942, she went forward, taking a lot of flack, as you can imagine, from some of her counterparts, particularly those supporting of the Labor Party and supporting of the law move, the war effort, by saying, "No, I'm strongly believing in pacifism." Sometimes these sort of backfires. So, in one of her memoirs, this book, which is called Stories from My Life, she tells about how she and her second husband, Richard Reynolds, sort of adopted a guy named Frank Stanley, who was a multiple time convicted murderer, and they brought him into their house, and they said, we're going to reform him through our good example. And he proceeded to burglar their house, even stealing Reginald Reynolds' suit, among many things, so he could hawk it. And it's funny because, sort of in remorse, while he was in prison, Mannin never lost faith in the guy, so she went to testify to get him parole. And while he was in prison, he sewed a suit for Reginald Reynolds, and here you see Reynolds, being nice enough to pose for a photo in this homemade or jail-made suit. She was very much one to take the side of the what she perceived as the outsider and the underdogs. And this is illustrated by a couple of novels that she wrote around the time of An American Journey. And she mentions the first in the book itself, which is The Road to Beersheba. And then the second novel, which came out right after her journey, The Night and Its Homing. Both of these dealt with the plight of the Palestinian diaspora at a time, this was coming up to the 1967 war with Egypt, where it was very much Israel was seen as the underdog and the Arabs seen as sort of a uniform mass of the bad guys. And so she was taking a controversial position in saying that. And so she this first book, The Road to Beersheba, was about the essentially the exile of large chunks of the Palestinian population from Israel as part of the creation of the State of Israel in 1948. She also, with her many novels and her many memoirs, she also wrote many, many travel books. And her very first was sort of symbolically titled Forever Wondering. And that's sort of a good description. Actually, Sunset on Dartmoor kind of reflects on the fact that when she decided to settle in her town, in her house there in the south of England, that she sort of said, I can't keep traveling now that I'm 75, 78, et cetera. But Forever Wondering is a good description of kind of her way of approaching. She was restless, to say the least. And so she wrote quite a lot of travel books. This isn't all of them. This is most of them. But she wrote a good dozen plus travel books, and she was never too fearless to go in difficult places. So, for example, Jungle Journey that you see over there on the left-hand side, she took a trip across India and Pakistan within months of partition in 1949, when that was not a really safe place to go. But that's a sort of reflective of her attitude towards things. She was more than willing to dive in and go into dangerous places. And then we come to American Journey, and what a contrast here between these covers. So this is the cover you see on the left, and American Journey is the one. This was an edition put out for the Travel Book Club in the UK. And what I didn't realize is I picked up a couple of these just because I love this, and I opened it yesterday when this is one I bought just to have a collectible copy and wanted to give out. And I noticed that she had actually signed it, so this is a signed copy to somebody named John Hale, with best wishes from the author to encourage him to visit the Grand Canyon next time. So somebody she knew. Versus what the UK publisher put out, which is a pretty boring cover, I think. This book, by the way, as far as I know, was never published in the US. So that's one of the things we also do with bringing out our Boiler House Press edition is we have it available throughout the U.S. She sort of used an excuse. So she had come to Washington in '64 for a variety of reasons to Washington, D.C., and she mentions that in the book. But then she decided in '65 that she was going to come back, partly because Boston University had an archivist who was collecting her papers and her works, and she decided that she would go to Boston and kind of see that it was being properly managed. So April '66, she pops up to Boston, spent a few days. She offers an interview, and in classic Ethel Mannin fashion, she jumped right on. Within a few days after that interview came out, she had to write an angry letter to the editor saying, for example, that my forthcoming novel, The Night and Its Homing, is not concerned with the Jewish diaspora. Um, the diaspora she's writing about in that novel is the Palestinian diaspora. Over 1 million Palestinians displaced and dispossessed, scattered in exile throughout the world, and more than 500,000 rotting in camps. And just sort of another example of how many of the things that Mannin observes in American Journey and other books sadly have not changed for the better. So in American Journey, she decides, and this is again, you already get a classic taste of Ethel Mannin in her character, in her first encounter with American systems in the Port Authority bus terminal, the old one in New York City, as she tries to figure out how she navigates this trip ticket that she's got and where she's got to go. And she goes from New York to Chicago, Tulsa, Oklahoma. So some of her travels actually paralleled those that Joanna writes about in Greyhound. Across Arizona, a lot of the book talks about Arizona, and I think one of the striking things about this book is the fact that she uh, deals with in a way that really not many, not hardly enough American writers, but sure enough, not foreign observers coming to the United States write about the situation of Native Americans, particularly on the very large reservations in Arizona. And one of the places she stops, which Joanna visited as well, is Holbrook, Arizona, which is one of those places where a couple of highways cross and they plop down some motels and restaurants, and suddenly it becomes a town. And she mentions that, essentially says early in the chapter where she talks about it, uh, she says Holbrook was an experience every traveler really trying to see the United States should spend one night in such a place. And she goes on to say in a passage that Joanna quotes, there is nowhere to go oh, let's see. Uh, Holbrook has Hopi and Navajo reservations to the north and Mormon settlements in the White River and Apache country to the south. What it has in between is its quite incredible nothingness. This is something which has to be experienced to be realized. When you're not working in the lumber trade or the sheep and cattle business or on a gas station or in a motel or a bar or a restaurant, there is nothing whatever to do in Holbrook. Well, there is a cinema. I'm sure there's no cinema now. There are bars, but there are not many films you can see more than once, and the bars range from men-only, hard-drinking deadliness to the deadly dullness of the respectable ones. There is no place to go in Holbrook. And, there are definitely places like that in the American West that are just, they're something nothings or something, I guess you would say. But one of the other things is she brings a light to some of the aspects of actually sort of encouraging signs of Native American taking back authority over their own existence, and particularly the Navajo Irrigation Project and the fact that the tribes were taking more control over some of the fundamental resources that had been taken back. And as Joanna shows in Greyhound, the fundamental question, and actually in her first book, uh, the fundamental question of water rights remains such a huge issue in the West. And I don't think there were many observers who were coming on and writing books about travel in the United States who are picking up how fundamental that is to essentially how power is allocated in the West. It's funny, last week, in fact, my little condominium association signed a memorandum of agreement with the city of Missoula about improving a trail that goes along some of our property. And in talking to both the city's lawyer and the project manager for that, we said, boy, there's a lot of steps involved and it's very complicated. And they both chuckled and he said, this is nothing like a water rights agreement. And she ends up in Los Angeles, as she talks about. She part of it was to visit a friend of hers, a guy named Ricky Austin, who was an artist, an art collector, lived outside San Diego, and so some of it is the journeys that she takes with Ricky Austin, actually going back to Arizona. But this is also L.A. A year after the Watts riots. And she talks about that, about the fact of unemployment being of such a profound issue for the African American community in Los Angeles. What we don't remember in these days is that Los Angeles used to have this humongous defense industry and car plants, and it was the industrial hub of the West Coast, and a lot of that sort of died for a variety of economic reasons, but it left a large population without really viable employment opportunities. And again, Mannin notes that in ways that very few other observers were talking about. And of course, she goes and visits the Watts Towers, which are still an incredible symbol for the community. And then she comes back, and one thing you get from the book is that she definitely was sick of both buses and America by the time she was on her trip back. She couldn't wait to get on the boat to go back to England. And at least she's honest about that. She's not gonna not be honest because she's Ethel Mannin. And so one of the reasons Joanna and I are collaborating on this because I think it was from a Twitter post. God forbid we should mention Twitter, but I think it was back when Twitter was still a safe place to be. I'd mentioned An American Journey as you were posting about your 2023 trip, I think.
Right, right. Yeah, I
And
was putting photos up, and then you said something like, "Oh, have you heard of Ethel Mannin's book?" And I'd never heard
yes,
of it.
well, it disappeared. She wrote. Most of her work has disappeared. Quite honestly. And who's to say that a lot of it doesn't deserve to disappear? But one of my favorite stories. I'm going to digress here for a second. But one of my favorite, because my wife and I have twins, and one of my favorite stories is about the parents who had twin sons, and one was a extreme optimist and one was an extreme pessimist. And they thought, how can we've got to help these boys with their attitudes to help them be better able to take on the world, because it's not going to be that great and it's also not going to be that awful. So they decide one birthday, they ask the boys what they want, And they both say, we want a pony. So they give the pessimist a pony and they give the optimist a huge pile of horseshit. And they introduce and then after about an hour they go to see how the boys are doing. And the pessimist is sitting in front of the pony weeping. And they say, "Well, why are you so sad? You have a pony." And he says, "Yeah, but it's just gonna die someday." And then they walk over to the big pile of horseshit, and the optimist is digging through it and he's flinging it all over the place. And they say, "What are you doing?" And he says, "With a pile this big, there must be a pony in there somewhere."
Right.
And my attitude, if you've written as much as Ethel Mannin wrote, there's got to be a few ponies in there. And I think this is one of her ponies, so to speak. Well, let me put the one I'm trying to sell. Uh,
Yeah. I mean I absolutely love the book, and you very kindly sent me, I've got it here, the very old edition, cloth covered one, um as payment for writing on your website, on your Neglected Books website, about Ethel Mannin's book about Emma Goldman,
right.
which I think is another gem in the Ethel Mannin canon. And I mean, both books, it's really interesting. And I think you say this somewhere, Brad. You say how An American Journey tells us more about Ethel Mannin almost than it tells us about the United States. I think that's in your
Yeah,
on your
right.
website. And I agree with, I mean, th there's always two journeys when you're traveling, isn't there? There's the internal and the external. And I
Right.
think her internal journey is really interesting because she is, despite being very much, concerned with the worker and, her socialist ideals and so on, she's kind of snobby a little
Oh,
bit.
yeah.
Um, and I'm not American and I'm not British. I'm Canadian. So, reading about a very, very English woman traveling through the US was so interesting to me because they're both foreign. The traveler and the spaces she goes through, both foreign to me. So I found that really, really interesting.
Yeah, well, I mean, you get the strong impression in this book that she is a person who believes in people in the abstract, but actually finds many of them impossible to deal with or
Right.
unpleasant to deal with. So she's riding the bus, and a number of times she sort of pointedly says that she doesn't want to talk to any of her
Right.
fellow passengers.
Right. She doesn't really speak, and then she'll sort of throw in like, "Oh, when I was in DC, I was hanging out with, I can't remember, is it like the ambassador, the Turkish ambassador, no, the Libyan, I can't remember, some ambassador, she's sort of got
Iraqi, yeah.
Iraqi ambassador. Yes, that's right.
Yeah, a
Um,
guy who got executed by Saddam.
right.
Yeah.
Right. And so she's, wandering through his fragrant gardens and so on. Um, but I think, I do think her insights around, Native rights and African American rights, and as you pointed out, water rights, she's quite ahead of her time. I mean, before her in 1947, you have Simone de Beauvoir doing a similar journey. I mean, for very different reasons. She was on a book tour, a lecture tour. So it was all sort of paid for. But she also, talks about the superabundance and the sort of the wastefulness, the consumerism, all these things that Ethel Mannin, that was 20 years before. And then you have Ethel Mannin also kind of picking up on those things and the advertising. And yeah, it's I do feel like both of them are very much ahead of their time. And I guess you've got, the male writers like Henry Miller and so on and Steinbeck, we're also kind of doing that. But the fact that she's doing it on a bus makes it completely different. Brings
Right.
in a whole other dimension, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned in your book that there was the Beauvoir book, Irma Kurtz's book, which was from the early 80s, I think,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and then Ethel Mannin. And There really aren't too many examples. I did find one within the last year that I hadn't known about. This unfortunately doesn't have a dust jacket anymore, but it's Nathan Ash's The Road in Search of America. What a classic and sort of cliche title. But this is from 1937, and he rode a Greyhound bus all over the United States, sort of to see what was going on. He was a left-leaning kind of guy, and I mean, some of the things he reports are really sort of shocking. I mean, he goes into Arkansas and stays with in a black sharecropper. Um, to call it a house is it's I mean he says that essentially you feel the wind. It's so poorly made that there's you can see the outside through all the cracks through the boards, and you feel the wind and the rain brushing in, etc. uh, but no, that's it wasn't I mean, as you well know from your experience, it's not the preferred way to travel if comfort is a big factor for you.
No, I mean I was sort of jealous reading An American Journey because well, first of all, you can't get an across country ticket anymore. She's very
Right.
happy about that. She get that one ticket for is I can't remember how much. Is it $90? And she has three, she can do it in 3 months. She can use it for 3 months. Which actually in 2006 when I did my first bus trip, that still existed. And now because everything is sort of being privatized and chopped up and appified, and it's just so much harder. You can't do that anymore. You have to get distinct, trip. You have separate tickets for each little leg of your journey, and they don't line up anymore. There's all kinds of absolutely crazy routing that they're doing. To go from Phoenix to Vegas, they take you via San Bernardino on the
Right.
Greyhound app. Like it's 27 or 30 hours or something for an 8 hour journey. None of it makes sense. So when I'm reading Ethel Mann, I'm like, oh, yeah, it's so luxurious and so wonderful. But then the flip side of that is how so many, as you've alluded to, so many of the problems then are still around today. Racism, environmental issues around water, what she calls the native question or the Indian question, the way we treat, minorities and so on. Um, and that is enlightening, but also somewhat, depressing as well. Just how
Yeah.
some of the things haven't changed, you know.
Yeah, there isn't a strong sense of optimism. That's one thing that does to me contrast this book with Greyhound, is that somehow you manage to find some hope through a situation that in many ways is even. I feel like the odds against the underdogs, comparing an American Journey to Greyhound, it seems like the situation has deteriorated for the underclass in America.
It's funny because some people have said that Greyhound is, super depressing, but most people have said exactly what you just said. I don't know how, but I've come away sort of feeling weirdly hopeful, or at least some feeling like there's some glimmers of light there. And I think it's because I did speak to people. And actually, when you get away from social media, you get away from the people running the place, and you just speak to normal people, there are so many good people doing good things. And I don't want to sound like a sort of Pollyanna, but you can tune into that. It's like, tuning a radio. You can tune into those people. And it's heartening when you speak to people, with often with very little education, very little few resources and so on, who really want things to be better. They just don't have the means. And you sort of feel like, well, if those people could just get the means a little bit more, sort of, yes, a bit more, the ability to sort of live life how they want to. They don't particularly want to be living in this late capitalist, unfair situation, this system. Um, and so I think when you speak to those people, it does kind of, make you see the States very differently. I don't see the
Hmm.
United States as being Trump land particularly. I just don't because
Right, right,
so many people just aren't that.
right. As you said that, I wanted to run over and pull something I literally just printed out and stuck on our refrigerator, and so I won't quote it exactly, but it was something to the fact that if you think about the future and everything becoming horrible, you're going to lose hope. If you think about other people, then you'll find that there is hope for the future.
Yeah.
I'm not putting it correctly, but it is that sort of sense, and it's funny that you make that observation. She, she sort of Ethel Mannin in this book. She does a fair amount of like going to meet people who are representative of things, but she doesn't actually want to spend a lot of time just having casual conversations.
Right. Right. She doesn't do that at all. I mean, that doesn't sort of take away from the book because, the people she does meet are really, really interesting. And she
Yeah,
goes to the Watts Tower, as you said, which for people who don't know, it's this wonderful outsider work of art by a guy called Simon Rodia. And he made it over years and decades of his life. He's dead now, and then they were going to tear it down, but they've managed to save it. And it's these incredible towers made of found materials in Los Angeles. It's absolutely incredible. And I was shocked that she'd even heard of it. I mean, she had a real ear, a real nose for things. And then she goes to that community center as well in LA and
right.
speaks to an African American kind of community leader. So she does go and speak to people, but they're kind of people that she chooses. I get the feeling she doesn't really like being spoken to, right? In that kind of very English way. Whereas I'm all ears when someone's like chatting to me. I'm like, oh, this is interesting. Let me memorize it so I can put it in my book. I love all that. But she doesn't seem that interested in that.
Well, when you look at the volume of work she produced, you realize that focus was sort of her
Yeah.
superpower. But like all
Yeah.
superpowers, it has a super weakness,
Right. Right.
which is you,
Right.
you you don't vary your view necessarily. You're not into serendipity.
Right. Right. But I mean, she absolutely she was a sort of natural writer though, don't you think? I mean,
Absolutely.
it just, I mean, her sense, it's very clear, it's very crisp, it's very economical, and you get the sense she really knows what she thinks, and she just puts it down.
Right.
And I really love that. And, she's like that with her Emma Goldman book as well. And, that's, I think, in some ways, that's maybe, I mean, it's interesting in a very different way because it's a woman writing about another woman who's quite similar to herself. And
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
formally it's interesting because it's a biography, but she does bring in um, fictional elements. The sort of thing Fitzcarraldo would would publish today. It's not auto fiction, it's like biofiction. It's a
Right.
biography
Right.
with fictional,
Yeah.
which I've never really I don't know of any others that do that. Any other books like
Well,
that?
I think there's a lot more of that. I mean, not to detour into that, but I think it's an example of writing that it's like we've invented, creative nonfiction in the last 20, 30 years when, there were a lot of biographies that were full of invented
Yes.
material or that they creatively skipped over things because they had a preset design that the biography wanted to convey. And there are, I can't remember the title of it. Well, there's a woman named E.M. Butler who started out as a biographer. And I think it was Cambridge or Oxford. I mean, she was a Doness or whatever the term is, but she wrote a book about a German diplomat where at a certain point she describes encountering his ghost.
Wow. That's
Yeah.
very un-Ethel Mannin. I can't
Yeah.
imagine she would. But having said that, there's a bit in the Ethel in American Journey where she does talk about trees. I don't know if you remember that bit. And she
Yeah.
gets quite spiritual about it, which
Yeah, I
also
mean she
feels,
loved nature for sure. And there's a lot of passages, particularly in Sunset over Dartmoor, the last one. Um, that's kind of why she settled where she was because she loved the garden. She loved the greenery and seeing nature all around. But she had an agenda in many cases, so uh,
yes. I mean, not it's yes. I mean, it was an agenda that, aligns somewhat with my own, I would
right.
say. But yeah, I'm just looking for that bit where where she's talking about when she's talking about a National Park Service brochure when she goes to the California redwoods. Can I just read it out? Because it
Oh
feels
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
it feels quite contemporary, where she says, the forest is more than a collection of trees. It is a community of plants living together as a unit, each dependent on the other. Um, which is kind of ahead of its time because nowadays,
Oh
I
yeah.
don't know if you're familiar with Suzanne Simard and Finding the Mother Tree and this idea, scientists have only just worked out that trees communicate. And she's it sort of feels out of character for her. And then um, she adds, that seems to me well put because it conveys the feeling of the powerful life of the trees enduring for millennia, in comparison with which human life is puny in its brevity. And along with that, it conveys the feeling of the trees as sentient things, making contact with them an experience. Awe would seem to be the common denominator in the experience, the awe felt in the presence of mystery. I
Right.
mean, it's like a piece of contemporary nature writing. It's really
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean,
interesting.
the secret lives of tr trees was all about the fact that they're communal entities, not, standalone things. So I'd
And you
forgotten
don't
about
really get
that.
that in many books about taking a greyhound across the United States. You don't,
No.
right? It's
Right.
quite unique. She is quite unique. She does have a very unique perspective. And I think when she describes landscape, it's really well done,
Yeah.
even when it's like the built upon, the sort of um like when she's outside of Phoenix and she's talking about, all the sort of, the Native American craft stores and the kind of the sadness there in a way that she picks up on, because of their, the deracination of their culture and so on. And she's very kind of sensitive to place, isn't she?
Yeah. Well, even
Um,
that observation about Holbrook, I mean,
yeah,
many people would just say there's nothing here, and she would say, but that's what's interesting about it,
right.
or that's what.
She goes below the surface. She really, she's interested in who owns this land, what was on this land, what is on it now, what was on it, 100 years. She really does, and she does it very economically. I keep coming back to that word, it's not a big book,
No,
you
no,
know, but she
yeah.
packs a lot in there.
Yeah, most of her, but she didn't write big, thick books, although some of her books are approaching 400 pages.
Okay.
Uh, but most of her stuff. I mean, here are all these memoirs. They're all coming in about 220 to 250 pages. That seemed to be sort of well, yeah, here's one from the early 70s where she goes around
Really?
England at large. It's not, it's that seems to be her standard length. These are all 200 pages long.
Can
It's
I
no,
ask you, Brad, are you thinking of reissuing, or do you think there is some merit in reissuing some of Mannin's other books?
I definitely want to look at her two Palestinian novels to see how, what there is to that. I have German Journey, which is one I've wanted to read for a long time. I finally got a reasonable copy of that, where she goes to Germany right like in 46 or
Wow.
47
Oh my
when things were
gosh.
still pretty desperate. And I want to I want to read that partly because that fascinates me, the reconstruction of Germany in that period when the devastation was just so
Mm.
immense and widespread, and then people were still, putting it back together. It was a remarkable period. Especially after, 12 years of relentless Nazi rule.
Yeah, I mean her
So
timing is
I'm
very
open
good.
to it. Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
I think we'll have to see how this is received. And I mean, honestly, I think the success of Greyhound. I hope it's. I mean, it seems like it's gotten super very done very well critically. And I don't know what your sales are like, but I get the impression they're nothing to sniff at. And we're riding on your coattails to some extent. Uh, I mean, I think so far our sales have been above average for these, but our sales are so low on average, so the average is not necessarily something to shout about. So we'll see. I mean, I think she's a fascinating character, and I'm not. This isn't the last time I want to, deal with what she's done. And, I do hope somebody writes a broad. I don't feel up to the task. I think I'm in the wrong country to start with,
Mm.
from a research standpoint. Uh, I think she's one of those lives where I could see an 800-page biography or a really, really, really good 300-page one.
I think we need Hermione Lee on the case. She would be my pick for it. But I think the other thing about Manon is her timing. I mean, going to the United States, landing in New York in 1965. I mean, that's like the perfect year, right? To look at.
Right.
And I mean, you called her sort of Victorian. I see her more as a sort of Edwardian. She's still quite prim, but she's, also kind of socially, very open and culturally very open. Um, but to land there in 1965, I mean, what a brilliant choice of time, And as you
Right.
said, with landing in Germany when she did, I mean, these are sort of turning points. She finds places at turning points, which
Yeah,
is kind of
absolutely.
fearless. She's fearless,
She's definitely fearless.
which
She
is again quite unusual. I mean, I wish there were more accounts by women of crossing the US. And it is interesting that all the ones by women traveling on their own, they do involve public transportation as opposed to the men in their cars.
right, right.
Um, And, what's that all about? Like, I think there is something there about public transportation and being in a communal space that maybe attracts women more than men. I don't know.
Right,
It's
right.
something I haven't been able to crack really. And, even though she's not exactly a friendly seatmate, she doesn't question it, does she? She doesn't sort of go, "Oh, I wish I was
Huh.
flying," or
No,
you
no, no. I mean, this is not a woman who had a lot of second thoughts. I mean,
no.
I don't think her creative mode allowed for second thoughts. And so there
No.
isn't, there are some times when it's a downside is that there's not necessarily nuances, but she was so, as you said, she was so astute in, and she sees it and she says it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Unfortunately, it doesn't always get sorted, but
No, that would be good. Yes, some of
that
the
would be
issues.
asking too much. I just want to pop back for one moment to my presentation
Yes.
so we leave Ethel. So this actually comes from a wonderful, wonderful, fascinating book, Among the Bohemians by Virginia Nicholson. And she writes about Ethel Mannin as one of her characters, as one of her Bohemian characters. And and this is from the final chapter where she's sort of wrapping up and getting the cast off stage. And I love this passion she felt was for the young, but quote, the unending struggle against injustice and barbarism in the world was perennial. And she never maybe in her very, very last days, she gave up that fight, but she didn't. She was a fighter for causes up to her last moment. And if you consider the 20th century, and she was active from certainly 1920 to days before her death in 1984. What a span of time. The people she knew, as Leslie Hall said before we started recording, she knew everybody in England who was remotely connected with the political or literary world of her time, and her time was quite a long time. So that's pretty impressive. So before we end, I want to open it up if we have any folks in the audience who have a question or comment that they'd like to make. We'd certainly be happy to entertain them. Just come off and mute or drop something in the chat. Okay. If not, I will just say again that An American Journey is back in print. You can get it wherever you're happy to get your books. So if you like to work through a local bookshop, which is fantastic, it is available from all the various distribution channels that they have access to. We have ones we prefer them to use from a business standpoint, but honestly, use whatever you want. Support your local bookseller. If you want to get it online here in the U.S., it's available, of course, through Amazon, but we would prefer you use Asterism Books, which is an independent press distributor based in Seattle. Wonderful people, and their prices are just as good as anybody else's, and their service is fantastic. So, uh,
And can I just add, in the UK, we've got bookshop.org if people
yes,
do need to.
bookshop.org carries all of our books, and their service is fantastic. So it's been great. I hope folks find it an entertaining read. I mean, to me, I always say for this series, we don't have an academic agenda. We don't have a political agenda. We really are fundamentally, the first question I ask when I look at a book is it still a good read? Can you sit down, be entertained, being enlightened by it, uh, be frustrated or angry by some things you've discovered in it? And I think An American Journey checks all those boxes and more, and it's a good entertainment. So thanks everybody for joining us today. Thank you, Joanna, for taking the time and to support us in this effort. I have to say, I relied a lot on the fact that you thought it was worth reissuing. It played a big role, played a big factor in my decision to go forward with. And fortunately, the other great thing was I was not. It didn't take too long to find Ethel Mannin's granddaughter so that we could secure the rights, because that's always a key thing with any of these reissues.
Yeah, and I
So
think can I just add that I think it's a really, like, it's almost, I would say it's an important document, really. These sort of state of the nation a little bit works that allow you to go back and see how things were described and see how things, felt back in the 1960s. I think it's a really important, I think people will be referring to it in years to come.
I hope so. I hope so. Yeah, it's. I mean, she is such an observer, isn't she? I mean,
Yeah.
and reporter, and as you say, I want to look further into the travels that she took to tap
Me
into
too.
that, because I think this isn't the only thing she did that's worth rescuing for sure.
Yeah, great. Good.
Well, thank you for joining us, and happy reading, everyone. Take care, and thank you, Joanna.
Oh, thank you so much, Brad. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Go Greyhound and leave the driving to us. Go Greyhound
and leave the driving to us.